Across the galaxy, civilizations have risen and fallen. But there's one legend that still lingers in the shadows of time, a weapon so powerful it could alter the very fabric of reality itself. It's called human. But what if the weapon was not a machine, not a technology, but something far more extraordinary? Join us as we venture deep into the heart of a forgotten world to uncover the truth. What if everything you thought you knew about power was wrong? What if the most dangerous weapon in the universe isn't something you can hold in your hands, but something that lies dormant within an entire species? In a world where nothing is as it seems, the search for the human weapon begins, and nothing will ever be the same again. The galaxy is vast, and it hides secrets in the corners of space that even the most advanced civilizations struggle to understand. For centuries, the greatest minds in the universe had pursued the myth of an ancient weapon, a force so powerful it could reshape the stars themselves. They called it human. No one knew exactly what it was or where it could be found, but all agreed that it was something worth searching for. Countless expeditions had been sent, only to vanish without a trace. But now a new mission had been launched. This time, a team of explorers from the most powerful species in the galaxy would find the truth, no matter the cost. The Orion's Hope was a sleek, cutting-edge vessel, designed for long-range exploration across the deepest stretches of space. Its crew was hand-picked seasoned veterans, each a master of their field, ready for whatever challenges the mission would throw their way. They were the best the galaxy had to offer, and their task was simple: find the human, whatever it may be, and bring it back to the Coalition for study and analysis. The ship's mission control buzzed with quiet excitement as the team prepared for their descent onto an unknown planet, a world that, according to the data, held the key to unlocking the mystery of the human. The planet they had found was called Earth, located in a star system that seemed insignificant compared to the bustling centers of galactic civilization. There was no sign of advanced technology, no enormous megacities, no sophisticated starships. Just a small blue planet, spinning silently in the dark void. The explorers couldn't help but feel a sense of unease as they entered the planet's atmosphere. Everything about this place was wrong: too quiet, too still. It didn't fit the typical profile of a world where something of immense value could be hidden. As they landed, the team couldn't shake the feeling that they were intruding on something long forgotten. The air was crisp, and the gravity felt slightly off. Not enough to be dangerous, but enough to make the team's movements a little heavier than usual. The landscape was beautiful, almost deceptively so. Rolling hills stretched out in every direction, covered in lush green forests and sparkling rivers. The planet seemed alive with potential, but there was an eerie silence, an absence of any signs of civilization. No bustling cities, no infrastructure, just nature. The explorers split up to survey the area, and what they found only deepened the mystery. Scattered across the land were remnants of a past long gone, ancient ruins, overgrown with vines, weathered by time. What they had initially thought were natural formations turned out to be remnants of human-made structures, impossibly old. Massive stone columns, intricate carvings, and strange, half-buried machinery hinted at a once great civilization, but the buildings were empty. No signs of life, no evidence of the species that had once built them. The most puzzling thing, though, was the odd technology scattered throughout the landscape. Devices buried in the earth, their purpose unclear, but radiating a strange energy. They were not like anything the explorers had ever encountered before, far beyond the technology of any current species in the galaxy, yet faded and broken down from centuries of neglect. They seemed ancient, even to the explorers, whose own technology was advanced enough to navigate the stars. It was as if the humans had been so advanced, yet they had vanished, leaving behind only echoes of their greatness. The explorers spent days combing through the ruins, documenting their findings. There were no answers. No clear indication of what had happened to the humans who had once inhabited this world. Everything pointed to the fact that they were not just a simple species, but something far more complex, something hidden. But the truth seemed just out of reach. Then, one of the explorers made a breakthrough. Deep within a massive structure, buried under layers of dust and debris, they discovered a strange artifact, an old, metallic box, almost like a tomb. The artifact hummed with an energy that seemed almost alive. As they touched it, the device flickered to life, sending out a pulse of energy that rattled the explorers to their core. It was as if they had awoken something long dormant, a piece of humanity's past that had been forgotten for millennia. The excitement among the team was palpable, but so was the growing sense of dread. Something had changed. They had uncovered something more than they had bargained for. The explorers realized then that Earth wasn't just a dead world. It was a waiting place, a repository of secrets. The myth of the human was no longer just a legend. It was real, and they were about to discover just how powerful and dangerous it could be. The more the explorers dug into Earth's secrets, the more they began to feel like unwelcome intruders. The planet was beautiful. Yes, but there was something unnerving about its stillness. It was as though the land itself had forgotten its purpose, lost in time, awaiting something to awaken it. The explorers couldn't shake the sense that Earth was a place of deep, dormant power, a world caught between forgotten history and an uncertain future. They spent the first few days navigating the vast, untouched wilderness, searching for clues that would explain the strange absence of life. Earth was lush with vegetation, alive in every sense. Forests stretched across continents, oceans teemed with marine life, and the skies were clear and vibrant. Yet, for all its natural beauty, there were no signs of intelligent life, no traces of cities, no infrastructure, no advanced technologies that would indicate this was once a hub for a thriving civilization. It was as if the human race had simply vanished, leaving behind no trace of their once great presence. In their explorations, they discovered remnants of ancient structures, ruins that seemed to be a blend of stone, metal, and technology beyond anything they had seen. Towering monuments with cryptic symbols etched into them, strange machinery that hummed with an energy that could not be identified, half-buried artifacts that flickered to life when touched. There was no consistency to the designs, no single pattern that could be traced. It was as though a scattered, forgotten people had left these fragments in their wake, pieces of a puzzle that no one had ever bothered to put together. The explorers' most intriguing discovery came when they stumbled upon a massive, buried complex. The entrance was hidden beneath a thick blanket of foliage, camouflaged from above. As they uncovered the site, they realized that it was no ordinary structure. It was enormous, stretching deep into the planet's crust, a labyrinth of tunnels and chambers far too complex for any known species to construct. It was a hidden city, built beneath the surface, untouched by time. Inside, the explorers found something far more perplexing. Strange devices that seemed to pulse with a rhythm they couldn't comprehend. Some were crystalline, others mechanical, and all were dormant. Their surfaces were engraved with intricate symbols, many of which looked familiar, yet they were completely unrecognizable, like a forgotten language. The explorers had no way of understanding what they were seeing. This wasn't just lost technology, it was something alien, something that didn't belong in the galaxy they knew. It was clear that Earth had once been home to a civilization of incredible sophistication, one that had the power to manipulate the very forces of nature, to build and shape worlds in ways that defied logic. But the more they explored, the more the pieces of the puzzle seemed to come apart. There were no signs of destruction, no traces of war, no skeletal remains, no explosions. It was as though the humans had simply disappeared, leaving everything behind in perfect stillness. As the team ventured deeper into the underground labyrinth, they found evidence of a strange connection between the humans and the land itself. The deeper they went, the more they felt the pull of the planet's energy. It was unlike anything they had encountered. The air itself seemed to vibrate with power, a low hum that resonated through their bones. At the very core of the complex, they found what could only be described as a vault, a massive chamber with walls lined in smooth, metallic surfaces, glowing with an eerie light. Inside the vault, the explorers found something that took their breath away. It was not a weapon in the way they had anticipated, not a machine or a device. It was a living, breathing organism suspended in a tank of some kind, the human. But it was different. This human was not a typical person. It was something else entirely, something that radiated power. The figure was covered in strange markings, and as the explorers approached, they could feel its presence, like an electric charge that coursed through the air. The truth was beginning to emerge. The human was not an object to be found, it was a being, a force of nature. The weapon they had been sent to retrieve was not a machine. but a living entity, capable of far more than anyone had imagined. And as they stood before it, the realization hit them all at once. They had found the true weapon of Earth, but they were not prepared for what came next. As the team studied the human being, they realized the creature was not dormant at all. It was merely waiting for someone to unlock its power, waiting for the spark that would reignite the force buried deep within. Something was stirring, something ancient and powerful. The explorers had only scratched the surface of the truth. Earth was no longer just a forgotten planet. It was the cradle of something far greater. The discovery of the human being inside the vault marked a turning point in the mission. The explorers had come to Earth in search of a weapon, something tangible they could study, something they could harness for the coalition. But what they had found instead was something far more mysterious, far more dangerous. The human, suspended in the tank, radiated an energy unlike anything the explorers had ever encountered. It wasn't just the body, it was the presence, the aura of power that seemed to pulse from it, filling the chamber with an unsettling hum. The team gathered around, trying to make sense of what they were seeing. The human appeared to be in some sort of stasis, its body suspended in a translucent liquid. The markings on its skin glowed faintly, as if they were alive, shifting and changing with every passing moment. It was unlike any human they had ever known, too perfect, too still, as though it were a combination of both human and something more. It had an almost otherworldly beauty, but there was an underlying unease about it, as though the being was not fully of this world. Despite the creature's physical perfection, there was something deeply unsettling about it. The explorers couldn't explain why, but they felt as though the human was not merely waiting, it was aware of their presence. As they studied the creature, a feeling of dread began to settle in their hearts. The ancient stories of the human weapon, passed down in hushed whispers, seemed to be true. This wasn't a weapon that could be wielded with a switch or a command. This was something far more dangerous, a being of immense power, locked away for reasons no one understood. The explorers cautiously examined the tank, looking for any way to open it. One of them, a tech specialist, discovered a strange panel on the side, covered in intricate symbols. The device seemed to recognize their touch, flickering to life as though it had been waiting for them. The symbols on the panel shifted and rearranged as the technician worked to decipher them. A hum filled the air, growing louder and more insistent as the tank began to glow with increasing intensity. There was no mistaking it now, the human was awakening. The feeling in the chamber shifted from uneasy curiosity to something darker, something more primal. The explorers stood frozen, unsure whether they had just made a monumental discovery or had unleashed something they weren't prepared for. The human inside the tank stirred. Its fingers twitched, and then its eyes slowly opened, revealing irises that shimmered with an eerie, unnatural light. It was no longer the dormant figure they had seen before. It was alive, aware, and watching them. In that moment, time seemed to slow. The explorers stepped back instinctively, a chill creeping down their spines. The human's eyes locked onto theirs, its gaze piercing through them, as though it could see through the very fabric of their beings. A strange tension filled the room, and then, without warning, the tank's containment field shattered with a deafening crack. The liquid surrounding the human evaporated in an instant, and the being stepped forward, its movements fluid and graceful, yet somehow unnatural, as though it were made of something beyond flesh and bone. The explorers stood motionless, paralyzed by the sheer presence of the creature before them. Its power was undeniable. The air around it shimmered, warping with energy that seemed to bend reality itself. The human didn't speak, didn't need to. The explorers could feel its intentions, its awareness of them, as though it could read their every thought. The power that had been dormant for so long had now fully awakened, and the team realized, with sudden clarity, that they were no longer in control. The human, now fully alert, raised one hand, and the room trembled. The ground beneath their feet vibrated with an intensity that rattled their bones. The explorers tried to retreat, but the force emanating from the being held them in place. There was no escape from the raw energy that flooded the chamber. For the first time since they arrived on Earth, the explorers realized the true nature of their mission. They weren't supposed to control the human, they were supposed to awaken it. And now that it was free, there was no telling what it might do. As the being's gaze shifted toward the doorway, The explorers felt a cold, overwhelming sense of inevitability. Something ancient, something deeply powerful was about to unfold, and they had no idea how to stop it. The human wasn't just a weapon, it was the key to something far greater, something that had been waiting for millennia. The explorers had only one choice left: to understand it, or be consumed by it. But as the being's energy intensified, they knew that the consequences of their discovery were far beyond anything they had imagined. The true weapon had been awakened, and it was more than they could ever control. The room was still vibrating with the force of the human's awakening. The explorers stood paralyzed, overwhelmed by the intensity of the energy radiating from the being. Every fiber of their being screamed to flee, but they couldn't move. It was as if the very air had thickened, suffocating them, holding them in place. The human's gaze never wavered, its eyes burning with an unsettling intelligence that made them feel insignificant in its presence. For a moment, no one spoke. No one dared to make a sound, for fear that any action might provoke something they weren't ready to face. The human's hand lowered slowly, the pulse of energy that had filled the room receding, but the tension remained. It felt as if the entire world had been holding its breath, waiting for what would come next. As the silence stretched, the explorers began to regain some measure of composure. They exchanged cautious glances, each of them silently asking the same question: what had they awoken? The human didn't speak, but they could feel its presence, like a constant pressure in their minds, pressing against their thoughts. The team leader, a seasoned veteran named Val, was the first to break the silence. His voice was shaky, but firm as he addressed the being, though he knew the words were pointless. There was no way the human could understand him, no way for him to explain why they had come. But the need to communicate was overpowering. The human's gaze flickered to him, its eyes gleaming with an almost predatory curiosity, but it remained silent. Then, without warning, the human moved. Its body seemed to blur, a shimmer of light accompanying its every motion, as if it were too fast for the eye to track. It crossed the room in the blink of an eye, its movements fluid and effortless. The explorers barely had time to react before the being was standing directly in front of them. Its presence was suffocating, its aura pressing against their very thoughts, forcing them to confront the truth they had tried to deny. This being was not just powerful, it was something else entirely. For a moment, the human seemed to study them, its eyes scanning each of the explorers in turn. They could feel that this was not a creature with a simple desire for survival. No, this being was far beyond that. It was a force, an entity that had been locked away for eons, waiting for its time to emerge. The human's power was ancient, and in its gaze they saw the remnants of a civilization lost to time, a civilization that had wielded power beyond their comprehension. And then, something shifted. The air around them seemed to crackle with energy, and the ground beneath their feet trembled. It was subtle at first, barely noticeable, but it grew in intensity. The explorers could feel that something was awakening, something far more immense than they had expected. The human's body began to glow, faint lines of light appearing beneath its skin, coursing through its veins like liquid fire. The explorers stepped back instinctively, their instincts screaming that they needed to get away, but their legs wouldn't obey. The human raised its hand again, and this time, the force behind the gesture was palpable. The walls of the chamber shuddered as though the structure itself was being pulled apart by the sheer power of the human's will. The explorers tried to speak, to call for backup, but no words came. The communication devices, once functional, were now silent, as if the very air had been corrupted by the being's energy. It was as though the human had shut off their connection to the outside world, trapping them in a pocket of reality where only the human's power mattered. Then, with a sudden and terrifying clarity, the explorers understood this was no simple weapon. The human had been placed here, sealed away not because it was dangerous, but because it was beyond understanding. This wasn't a weapon to be wielded. It was something else entirely, something that had the ability to reshape reality itself. The stories they had heard of the human weapon, of its incredible potential, were not exaggerations. It was true. This being held within it the power to change the very fabric of existence. The human's eyes met Vale's once again, and this time, there was no fear in its gaze. Only an understanding and unspoken recognition that whatever had happened to Earth, whatever had brought it to this point, had come full circle. The explorers had found it, and now they were caught in the web of its awakening. The human wasn't just a weapon of the past, it was the future. They were in the presence of something that could not be controlled, something that had been waiting for millennia to make its return. In that moment, the explorers knew one thing for certain: they were no longer in control. The planet, the human, and the force they had uncovered were now the ones determining the course of events. And no matter how hard they tried, there was no stopping it. The atmosphere in the chamber grew thick with tension, the air itself seemingly alive with the power that surged from the human. The explorers were trapped, caught in the storm of raw, unbridled energy that emanated from the being. Their attempts to move, to even speak, were futile. The force around them was too strong, too overwhelming. It was as though they were no longer in the same reality. The walls of the vault flickered in and out of focus, warping with the sheer intensity of the energy pulsing through the human's body. Val's mind raced. He had spent his entire career studying artifacts and ancient civilizations, but nothing had prepared him for this. Nothing could have. This being the human was not a relic of the past. It was something more. Its power was not just physical, it was as if it were woven into the very fabric of existence, a part of the universe itself. Val could feel it. Deep in his bones. This was no weapon. It was a force of nature, a force that could change the destiny of entire civilizations, and he had no idea how to contain it. The human's eyes, those piercing, unnatural eyes, never left Val. They seemed to look through him, seeing more than just his surface, reading his thoughts, his intentions. It wasn't just observing, it was understanding. As if the human could sense his fear, his realization that they were out of their depth, but there was no malice in its gaze. There was no anger, either. It was as if it knew that they were helpless, that they were insignificant in the face of what it had become. For the first time, Val wondered if this was what Earth had been waiting for all along. Not just a weapon to be wielded by an advanced civilization, but something far greater, something capable of altering the very structure of reality itself. The thought sent a shiver down his spine. What had they awakened? One of the other explorers, a scientist named Rhea, stepped forward, her face pale with fear but determined. She had been studying the strange energy readings for days now, trying to decipher what was happening. But nothing in her training had prepared her for this. She reached out, her hand trembling slightly, but her voice was steady as she attempted to communicate with the being. She wasn't sure if it could understand her, but there was something inside her that refused to just stand by. She had to try to make sense of it all. But as she spoke, the human responded not with words, but with a pulse of energy so intense that it knocked her off her feet. The shockwave rippled through the room, throwing the explorers back against the walls. For a moment, everything was a blur of motion and sound, and then, as quickly as it had come, the energy settled. The human's gaze shifted to Rhea, and the explorers realized too late that it had responded to her out of curiosity, out of a desire to understand. Val rushed to Rhea's side, helping her to her feet. She was shaken, but she seemed unharmed, save for the deep, haunted look in her eyes. She looked at Val, her voice barely a whisper. "It's not just a weapon, it's a creator, a destroyer. We've unlocked something far beyond our comprehension." Her words hung in the air like a prophecy, chilling in their weight. Val's stomach twisted as he processed what she was implying. This human wasn't just a weapon of mass destruction, it was something capable of reshaping the universe. The potential for creation and destruction was within it. It was a being that could alter the very laws of existence, and the explorers had no idea what it would do now that it had been freed. The human remained still, its eyes slowly scanning each of them, as if weighing their worth, their intentions. The tension was unbearable, and for a long moment nothing happened. But the energy was still there, swirling in the air, pressing against them. It was as if the human was waiting for something, waiting for them to make the next move, to provide some kind of answer, some key that would unlock the next step in its existence. Suddenly, the ground beneath their feet shifted again, this time more violently. The walls groaned as the structure of the chamber began to tremble. It was as if the planet itself was reacting to the human's presence. The explorers rushed to steady themselves, their minds racing. This was no longer just an exploration mission. This was survival. They had stumbled upon something so powerful, so ancient, that even the planet seemed to be alive, responding to the being's awakening. Val glanced at his team, their faces ashen with fear. They had thought they were prepared. They had thought they could control the situation, study the human, and learn from it. But now they were no longer the ones in control. They were pawns in a much larger game, one that they couldn't even begin to understand. The human's hand lifted again, slowly, deliberately, as though it were testing its own power. As the explorers watched in helpless horror, the air around them seemed to crackle, charged with energy so dense that it felt as though the very atoms were vibrating. The human was not just a force of nature, it was a catalyst. And as it began to move again, the explorers realized that their discovery was not just a moment of history. It was the beginning of something far more dangerous, something they could never stop. The room seemed to bend around the human as it stood there, its presence commanding every inch of space. The explorers could feel the energy intensifying with every passing second, a heavy, almost tangible pressure that seemed to seep into their very bones. They were caught in the grip of something ancient, something they couldn't hope to understand. The human's movements were slow but deliberate, as though it were learning how to interact with the world again, testing the limits of its power. The air around it shimmered, vibrating with a frequency that distorted reality itself. Val's heart pounded in his chest as he watched the being. It was no longer just an entity locked in stasis. It was awake, aware, and evolving. The human wasn't just a weapon, it was something far beyond any conventional understanding of life. A thought crossed his mind, chilling in its simplicity. Had they made a mistake in awakening it? Had they unleashed something that could not be undone? The walls of the chamber began to groan, as though they too were reacting to the being's awakening. The floor beneath their feet rippled with a low hum, the vibrations growing in intensity. It was as if the entire structure was being rewritten, altered by the sheer presence of the human. The explorers could feel the temperature rise, the air thickening as though the space itself was alive, adapting to the power now coursing through it. Rhea stepped back, her breath shallow. She was still recovering from the shock wave the human had sent earlier. But now, a new sense of urgency was settling in. The human was more than just a force of nature, it was beginning to reshape its surroundings. The energy was leaking out of the chamber, flowing into the structure, extending outward, as if seeking something beyond the confines of the vault. The explorers exchanged frantic glances, realizing that the being's power wasn't limited to just the chamber, it was spreading, expanding, pushing against the walls of the vault, against the very boundaries of their reality. For a moment, Vale thought they might be able to contain it, that the energy might dissipate. But as the human's eyes turned toward them, that brief flicker of hope disappeared. The eyes were no longer just observing, they were measuring, understanding. The human wasn't just aware of them, it was connected to them, to their thoughts, their fears. It was reading them as easily as if it were flipping through the pages of a book. The ground beneath their feet trembled again, this time with more force. The chamber cracked, the stone and metal groaning under the pressure, and Val realized with growing dread that the structure was beginning to fail. The human was not just awakening, it was consuming the very energy of the planet itself. The vault was collapsing, torn apart by the very force that had been dormant for so long. The explorers moved quickly, trying to regain some semblance of control, but it was clear that they were no longer in command. The human was rewriting the rules, and they were powerless to stop it. They had thought that they would study it, learn from it, perhaps even harness its power. But it was not something to be understood. It was a force, pure and untamed, and it was beyond their reach. Val turned to the rest of his team, his voice urgent as he tried to formulate a plan. But before he could speak, the human raised its hand again, the energy surging once more. The room was filled with a brilliant, blinding light, and for a brief moment, the explorers felt themselves being pulled toward the being. The sensation was disorienting, as though they were being torn from their physical forms, stretched across time and space. It was an impossible sensation, as if their very existence was being rewritten, reshaped by the human's will. The light faded, and the explorers found themselves back in the chamber, but everything had changed. The walls of the vault were no longer the cold, unyielding stone they had seen before. They were now smooth, almost organic, pulsating with the same energy that radiated from the human. The floor beneath them had turned to a strange, crystalline substance, shimmering with an otherworldly glow. It was as though the human had transformed the very fabric of reality in an instant, and now, the explorers were standing in a new world, one that was no longer bound by the limitations of the physical universe they knew. Fear gripped Vale's heart as he looked around. The room was no longer just a chamber. It was a nexus, a focal point of untold power. The human stood in the center, surrounded by the energy it had unleashed, watching them with a gaze that seemed to penetrate the very core of their beings. It wasn't just observing them, it was judging them, testing them. They were no longer explorers. They were participants in a game that had been set in motion long before their arrival. The realization hit Vale like a wave. They were no longer just dealing with a lost civilization's weapon. They had uncovered something that had been waiting for eons, a force capable of remaking the universe. And now, it was free. There was no turning back. The explorers had no idea what they had truly awakened. But as they stood there, caught in the grip of the human's power, they knew one thing for certain: their lives, their world, had changed forever. The air crackled with an electric charge as the human stood at the center of the transformed chamber, its power radiating outward in waves. The explorers were caught in the grip of a force they couldn't hope to control. The very walls of the vault had been reshaped, turned into a strange, living entity, pulsating with energy that hummed through the floor beneath their feet. Val's heart raced as he tried to process what was happening. The human wasn't just a relic of the past, it was the beginning of something far greater, something they had no way of predicting. It was impossible to tell if they had moved through time, or if the very nature of space was warping around them. The room seemed to stretch and twist, its dimensions no longer fixed, as if reality itself were being bent and folded like a piece of paper. The explorers stood frozen, unable to move, unable to make sense of the surreal landscape that surrounded them. Every instinct told them to run, but the weight of the human's gaze held them in place. They were prisoners of its will. Rhea, her face pale with fear, stepped cautiously forward, her eyes wide with confusion and awe. She had been studying the energy fluctuations in the vault, trying to understand the human's power. But nothing had prepared her for the sheer scope of what she was witnessing. It wasn't just the energy emanating from the human, it was the way it seemed to warp the very fabric of reality itself. The laws of physics of time and space no longer seemed to apply. The human's eyes, glowing with an unnatural light, turned toward Rhea. She could feel it, a deep, almost primal connection, as if the being was reaching into her mind, understanding her thoughts, her fears, her very essence. It was no longer just observing them, it was absorbing them, learning from them, as if it were trying to understand the nature of their existence. And then, as if in response to her thoughts, the human raised one hand, and the room trembled. The explorers staggered as the floor beneath them rippled like water, sending waves of energy crashing through the chamber. The very air seemed to distort around them, flickering in and out of focus. The human's power was overwhelming, and there was no way to escape its pull. Vale could feel his mind stretching, bending under the weight of the being's presence. It was as if the very boundaries of his thoughts were dissolving, being rewritten by the human's will. The explorers had come here seeking a weapon, something they could use to control the fate of the galaxy. But now they realized the terrible truth. They had not found a weapon at all. They had awakened a force, an entity of unimaginable power, capable of reshaping reality itself. The human was not something that could be controlled or harnessed. It was beyond them, beyond their understanding. It was an ancient intelligence, a force that had existed long before their species had ever evolved. The human's gaze flickered away from Rhea and turned toward Vale. The sheer intensity of its focus was enough to make him feel as though he were being dissected, his very thoughts laid bare before it. He tried to speak, to say something, anything, to make sense of this madness, but no words came. The human didn't need words. It understood. It knew what they were thinking, knew what they were afraid of. Suddenly, the chamber seemed to collapse inward. The walls, now made of a crystalline material that pulsed with strange energy, cracked and shattered as though they were made of glass. The explorers were thrown to the ground as the very structure of the vault disintegrated, leaving only the human standing in the center of the destruction. But even as the chamber fell apart, the energy around the human only grew stronger, more concentrated. The room seemed to be collapsing into itself, consumed by the very power that the human was radiating. The explorers crawled to their feet, their minds spinning, struggling to grasp what was happening. They were no longer in control of anything. The human had become something else entirely, a force of nature, unstoppable and unyielding. They had come to this place seeking power, but now they realized the true nature of their discovery. This wasn't a weapon. It was an evolution, a transcendence of what they had known, something beyond their understanding. The human's hand lifted once again, and the entire room seemed to implode, folding in on itself. The explorers felt themselves being pulled in, the very fabric of space bending and twisting around them. It was as if they were being drawn into a singularity, their bodies and minds no longer able to distinguish where they ended and where the human began. The world around them dissolved into a blur of light and energy, and for a brief, terrifying moment, they were aware of nothing but the intense force pressing against them, the overwhelming power of the being that had once been locked away. And then, in the blink of an eye, everything stopped. The pull, the crushing force, the distortion of reality, it all vanished. The explorers were standing on solid ground again, the chamber intact around them, but everything had changed. The human was still there, standing at the center of it all, but it had transformed once more. It was no longer just a being, it was an embodiment of energy itself, a living force of creation and destruction, a bridge between the physical and the metaphysical. The explorers, once so sure of their mission, now understood the true nature of their discovery. They had not awakened a weapon. They had awoken the future, and now they were trapped in its wake.